newspapers, at the Library of Congress in Washington, or in the archive of the New York Symphony Orchestra, which is now in New York Public Library. The author Howard Shannett, discussing the New York Symphony Orchestra in his History of the New York Philharmonic, shed some valuable light on Damrosch's practice in appointing players. He says, in building up his orchestra, Damrosch frequently imported musicians from Europe. In this, he had the advantage over the Philharmonic, which, as a cooperative society, was naturally reluctant to bring its own competition from abroad. In 1891, when he was hastening to strengthen his orchestra, Damrosch persuaded the Union to waive the 6 months rule so he could bring in the Russian violinist Adolf Brodsky as concertmaster. This 6-month rule was to cause no end of problems, and we'll return to it later. The chief sources that we do have are Anna Brodsky's less than wholly objective recollections of a Russian home, which she published in Manchester in 1904, and the contemporary New York press. Yet, when we look at these in more detail and with a willingness to read between the lines, what might be imagined as a brief interlude emerges as a critical juncture in Brodsky's career, which illuminated his artistic values and his readiness to return to Europe. So the story starts in Leipzig in 1891. Brodsky had been professor of violin at the conservatoire there since 1883. That's where he formed his first string quartet. So that's where he developed or continued friendships with people like Brahms, Grieg, Busoni, Tchaikovsky, and not least Ottokar Novacek, the pupil who was also to end his short career playing for Damrosch in New York. Particularly frustrating is the lack of any material relating to Brodsky's invitation from Damrosch. There's a short biographical article published in Vienna towards the end of Brodsky's own career, which simply mentions that in 1890 Brodsky received an invitation from New York to take over the leadership of the orchestra. In one of his last letters to Tchaikovsky, Brodsky justified his decision to accept Damrosch's offer on the grounds that I was especially tempted, beside the good pay, by the fact that after working for 7 months, for the other 5 months, I'll be completely free. Freedom in this case implies the ability to carry on with concert giving in Europe, including visits back to Russia. And for his part, Tchaikovsky assured him that I have long known through Damrosch about your appointment and approved your decision to move to America. I'm convinced you will settle there favorably and that you will be satisfied from every angle. But will you not fret just a little about the warm corner you made in Leipzig? On the 23rd of October 1891, the Brodskys left their warm corner for New York, sailing from Hamburg on the first Bismarck. They arrived on the 31st of October. Brodsky's first concerts with the New York Symphony were the following month. Anna Brodsky, refusing to call either the orchestra or its conductor by name, recorded her husband's quickly feeling uneasy with the experience. After the very first rehearsal with the X orchestra, he came home disappointed and out of spirits. He daily met with musicians of a type quite new to him, a type which could only have developed in a country where there was no tradition of serving art for art's sake. He soon saw that money was everything in America, the universal center of gravity. Even the talent of musicians was measured by the money they earned, and the true love of art seemed very rare. Two alternatives remained for him, either to return to Europe immediately and break his contract, or to stay and to create a new position for himself more suitable to his artistic tastes. He chose the second way. For Brodsky, this second way entailed a re-involvement with chamber music, through which Anna claimed he gathered strength and courage for the rest of his work. Her assertion that this was made possible by negotiating a restriction in the number of popular orchestral concerts in which he played, though, should be viewed in conjunction with this announcement, which appeared in The Sun on the 1st of November 1891. And I hesitate to remind you, this is not the popular tabloid of today. This is the New York Sun. Mr. Walter Damrosch announces that he has formed a string quartet composed of 4 distinguished members of his orchestra, which will appear at Chamber Music Hall Building in 8 chamber music concerts on Sunday afternoons beginning December. If the decision to form a quartet led by Brodsky really was Damrosch's, it might well have been a ploy to keep his new concertmaster on his side. He might also have wanted to enter into competition with Gustav Dannreuther's Beethoven String Quartet, which already gave a brief season in New York. Either way, an element of risk was involved. For, as Anna further comments, this was something quite new to New York, and our acquaintances predicted that it would be a complete failure. She notes too that the audience was small but appreciative, and was struck by the fact that the general attitude to art was curiously primitive and materialistic. More significantly, the audience for Brodsky's chamber concerts was self-selecting. In a comment that had once been made in respect of Halle's Manchester chamber concerts, and which would be echoed in the pages of the Manchester Press some 2 decades later, Anna wrote that those audience members, quote, who had been trained to appreciate music elsewhere were mostly Germans. The implication then that those best able to appreciate an imported musical culture were themselves émigrés from one of its cultural heartlands reveals a strain, I think, not just of Eurocentric thinking, but of an assumed cultural superiority. The assumption is not merely restricted to Anna's remarks, but can be identified as an important trope in Brodsky's chamber concerts themselves. His repertoire for the chamber concerts in the 1891-92 season would certainly have found favour with New York's German expatriates, since it differed little from that which he had until recently presented in Leipzig. The opening concert on the 6th of December in 1891 featured Schubert's Death and the Maiden, a Haydn quartet, and a third of Beethoven's Razumovsky's. It was probably Haydn Opus 17 number 5, because it was more or less the only Haydn quartet he ever played. The presence of 2 works as weighty as the Schubert and Beethoven on the same program might suggest a conscious decision not merely to showcase quartets, which by this stage could already be counted amongst his war horses, but to instill the notion that these were concerts to be taken seriously. Subsequent concerts also suggest that, like Halle in his initial Manchester chamber concerts, Brodsky constructed his quartets, his programs, to have a thematic or even a didactic purpose. To, for example, begin with quartets from Beethoven's Opus 18 and end with quartets by Schumann. Elsewhere in the 1891-92 season, there were performances of other quartets from the Razumovsky set, and furthermore, a substantial review of a concert from 1892-3 from that series makes it clear that in his second season, Brodsky was happy to repeat works he'd given in his first. Such a committed adherence to the Austro-German repertoire might also have had a secondary function for Brodsky, that of providing musical comfort zone, offering some respite from any sense of unease experienced by being estranged from his cultural roots. In this context, it's interesting to note that, unlike Dannreuther's quartet, he chose not to incorporate any music at all by American-born composers into his programs. Despite his continued keenness to construct programs around the Beethoven quartets, he didn't in his first season venture beyond Opus 59. If quartet recitals really were a novelty in New York, the later Beethoven quartets might not have proved so much of a box office draw. Admission costs were kept reasonably low. Single concerts were priced at $1 and $5 for the whole season. Nevertheless, the audience was very small for a city the size of New York. The concerts also appeared to have attracted very little press criticism, which doesn't make things easier for people researching it. Some of the concerts featured Damrosch himself as a pianist. Other guest artists included, for example, Ignaz Paderewski. For the 1892-93 season, Jan Kurt was replaced as the quartet's viola player by Otakar Novacek, who was newly appointed as Damrosch's principal viola. So for Brodsky, being reunited with his former Leipzig pupil and sometime quartet partner there justified his decision to program Novacek's E minor quartet in a concert in January 1893, and this was the first performance in New York of that work. And as in the previous season, Brodsky continued his willingness to present as novelties to New York audiences works he'd introduced in Leipzig, and on the whole, the programming for this season is just a little bit more adventurous than the preceding one. An overview published in the New York Tribune in October 1892 mentions that it was going to include Beethoven Opus 130, Beethoven's 132, the Grieg G minor quartet, quartets by Brahms, a suite by Goldmark, and a Saint-Saëns piano quartet. But these were the only two complete seasons of chamber concerts which Brodsky was to give in New York. The Brodskys embarked on their final transatlantic journey on the 6th of November, on which day Tchaikovsky died. When the news reached Brodsky is unknown, nor is there any real evidence of his response beyond his taking part in a memorial concert in New York later that year. Yet the loss of such a close friend must have weighed heavily on Brodsky and his reaction to the course of events that by the end of 1893 led to his being no longer the leader of the New York Symphony Orchestra or of its string quartet. Once again, Anna's recollections and contemporary press coverage offer complementary insights into the events which will lead to his resignation. At the start of the 1893-94 season, Damrosch replaced Anton Hecking as his principal cellist with the Danish cellist Anton Hegner. By implication, this would have involved a change of personnel for Brodsky's quartet, but this wasn't the prime issue. Not only was Hegner paid an inordinately generous annual salary of $3,500, but he was appointed in contravention of a ruling by the Musical Protective Union that no person could join the union without having first been resident in the USA for a minimum of 6 months. Damrosch justified his action by drawing a parallel with his waiving of this ruling for Brodsky himself, on the grounds that when Brodsky came over, he says, the union recognized him as an artist and suspended its rule. In response to Damrosch's request that the same criteria should apply to Hegner, the press noted that some members of the union, and who do not like Damrosch, objected. Those who did object were in one instance excused from performing, but Hegner remained. Matters came to a head in December 1893 when, according to the New York Evening Star, quote, Damrosch made a final appeal to the union in the name of art. One very candid member shouted, "Art be damned. We are after money." Then Damrosch resigned from the union. Now 16th of December, Damrosch called the orchestra's bluff. Knowing that by refusing to play, members would be breaking their own union agreement and not only subjecting themselves to a fine, which they could ill afford, but risked dismissal from the orchestra, he pointedly included Haigner in the concert. The members acquiesced under sufferance, but the following evening they determined to bring things to a climax, and when Damrosch took up his baton, there was no response to the usual signal for the band to play. Moreover, Mr. Brodsky knew what was coming and would not go on the platform with the orchestra that night. The concert was abandoned, and the audience was sent home without hearing a single note. In challenging his players through this deliberate act of provocation, Damrosch might well have had an ulterior motive, that of deflecting attention away from a major musical event taking place in the city's Carnegie Hall the previous evening. For several days previously, the New York press had devoted substantial column space to Dvorak's eagerly awaited new American Symphony. This, of course, is the famous New World Symphony, Opus 95. The New York Tribune, for example, had published a lengthy thematic guide in anticipation of its unveiling at an open rehearsal on the 15th of December, and its official premiere the following evening. Several days before, it had informed readers that a special interest attached to the second public rehearsal and concert of the Philharmonic Society next Friday afternoon and Saturday evening, from the fact that at them Dr. Dvorak's new symphony, written under the influence of American scenes and studies and entitled From the New World, will have its first performances. Further anticipation, or further evidence that the anticipation of the new symphony had generated a higher than usual level of interest among New York's concert-going public, is revealed in a further article printed in the New York Tribune later in the month, which noted that the fact that a very general interest has been aroused in the symphony by Dvorak is attested to by the unusually large number of tickets purchased by persons who do not attend the concerts of the Society as a rule. The appearance as late as the 24th of December of the article from which the above extract is taken might argue for a continued local press coverage of the symphony in the weeks following its premiere. However, the comparative lack of coverage in the intervening period suggests otherwise. In contrast, the press could not get enough of the crisis which had erupted at the New York Symphony Orchestra concerts. Damrosch had obviously succeeded in stealing Dvorak's thunder. The day after his abandoned concert, Damrosch sent all members of the orchestra a notification to the effect that their existing contract was terminated, with the option of accepting a revised one in which the orchestra's season was shortened by 6 weeks. They all accepted, except Brodsky, who expressed his views in a letter to the New York Tribune. As one for whom the 6-month rule had also been waived, he knew he had to tread carefully, but his argument was that it was the orchestra and not himself which had been most wronged. On the 20th of December, the New York Tribune reported, "Without being in a position to offer the musicians an assured assistance, Damrosch asks them to violate a law of the union, which is equivalent to the suggestion that they resign from the union and become wholly dependent on him. Aside from him, it would be utterly impossible for them to get an engagement. In case Mr. Damrosch should not raise the money necessary for next winter, what would the musicians do? Most of them have wives and children. Let the public think of these things before holding the orchestra responsible for the deeds of Mr. Damrosch and the union. For the implications of the reference to raising money for the following season, we can turn to Anna Brodsky again. She still refers to Damrosch only as X, but she explains that he relied on his influential father-in-law to act as a broker between the orchestra and a group of wealthy patrons. And when his father-in-law died, Anna says of Damrosch that the guarantors seemed to lose interest, and some of them withdrew, and the orchestra became a personal concern of X's. In order to make it more lucrative, he wished to alter his contract with members of the orchestra, so he arranged an artificial strike in a most ingenious way. If this were the case, then it was a huge risk to take, and it cost Damrosch his leader. Attempting to avoid such an outcome, he wrote to Brodsky, quote, a very polite and cordial letter begging him to renew his contract. It was met only with indignation, according to Anna, and tellingly, that letter hasn't survived. In refusing to accept Damrosch's revised contract, and in expressing his response in so public a manner, Brodsky was effectively committing professional suicide. His letter to the New York Tribune reads as a curious mixture of altruism in taking the orchestra's part and an appeal to his own professional integrity bordering on hubris. Instancing his own privileged position in respect of the union ruling, he reminds the reader that my own artistic status is guaranteed with or without Mr. Damrosch. Consciously or otherwise, Brodsky had engineered his own escape route from a musical culture in which he had never felt completely at home, and thereby opened up the possibility of a return to Europe. As Anna noted, and so at last, AB was free. The press fairly quickly lost interest in Brodsky's actions. A New York Tribune review of one of Damrosch's orchestral concerts early in the new year mentions the loss of Brodsky as an artist of worldwide fame, adding that Mr. Brodsky will be missed. It also corroborates Anna's claim that the strike was engineered, in referring to Haigner as being utilized as a handy agency for modifying the contract between Mr. Damrosch and his men. Lack of press coverage also makes it difficult to form a clear picture of the extent to which Brodsky was able to maintain a performing career in New York. Anna refers to several offers of alternative appointments, but says he declined everything, which argues for a wish not to remain in the USA, although adding the rider that he was obliged to fulfill other outstanding contractual arrangements. There's a certain irony in a reference to a chamber concert in April 1894, for example, in which he appeared alongside Anton Haigner and the pianist Zava Schavinka in the latter's piano trio. The Brodskys were certainly still in New York by the summer of 1894 and maintaining their apartment at 224 West Central Park, as revealed by an anecdote printed in the Shenandoah Herald in July of that year. By the winter of 1894, they were settled in Berlin, where Brodsky was able to fulfill a number of engagements as a concert soloist. It was here that he received Halle's invitation to come to Manchester, and this is where the next stage in the narrative begins. Anna takes up the story. One morning at breakfast, I saw a letter waiting for my husband, addressed in a handwriting quite strange to me. It was from Sir Charles Halle and began with the following words: I do not know if you have heard of me, but I know you very well by name, and had the pleasure of hearing you play the Brahms Concerto in London in 1883. He offered Brodsky the post of first teacher in the Royal Manchester College of Music, and the leadership of his orchestra, the Halle Orchestra. Before AB had time to give a definite reply, a second letter arrived from Sir Charles, and then a third. AB was so pleased with them that he felt more and more inclined to go to Manchester. Anna Brodsky, whose own experience of the northwest of England had been a disastrous sojourn in Liverpool as a young woman, initially attempted to persuade him from going. In fact, we had never agreed so strongly about anything as we did in this matter, she recalled. More significantly, she was of the opinion that Manchester figured as a large smoky place where cotton was very cheap and where people could not possibly care for music or have any idea what really serious music meant. I was sure that AB would never get an audience for the music he loved best, his string quartets. Moreover, Halle was not the only headhunter in the field. On exactly the same day on which Halle had first written to Brodsky, in the Mikhail Palais in St. Petersburg, a letter was drafted by Duke Georg Alexander of Mecklenburg concerning the possibility of Brodsky forming a string quartet for him. Although German by birth, the Duke was known in St. Petersburg society through his morganatic marriage to a Russian wife. More significantly, the letter implied that Brodsky himself had made an earlier move. In reply to your letter of 25th inst, I can be quite frank in telling you that the plans for my future string quartet still haven't reached a definitive form. And he refers to terms we discussed in St. Petersburg. The Duke expressed his keenness to form his own quartet and to have Brodsky lead it, but requested his patience for the time being, as he could not see anything falling into place before the coming autumn at the earliest. So if Brodsky had been negotiating an opportunity which would have allowed him to dedicate himself to his string quartets, quote, the Duke's letter, coming when it did, might well have placed him in something of an awkward position. After his unexpected departure from New York, an offer of a secure post must have been welcome. Halle was offering the greater security, but on unfamiliar territory and with no genuine guarantee of a substantial involvement in chamber music. Duke Georg offered the policy of developing his career as a quartet leader and in more familiar surroundings, but it remained just that, a possibility. If in the end Brodsky opted for security, it was by no means the end of the Duke's attempts to persuade him otherwise. When he wrote again in May, he was under the impression that Brodsky had already arrived in Manchester, since he began by asking how he liked it there, before inquiring whether he would still be interested in leading his quartet in the coming winter season for a fee of 5,000 rubles, and speculating that Brodsky's name alone might bring in an income to compare with what he would receive in Manchester. In the mid-1890s, 5,000 rubles was roughly equivalent to £500, so the Duke's offer was comparable to Halle's. The tone of the Duke's letter in June implies that Brodsky was at least tempted. I was delighted to see from your letter that even under circumstances, you were still inclined to take up my offer, he wrote. Refusing to be put off by Brodsky's coming to Manchester, he proposed to send him in January 1896 a formal offer for a season in 1897 with rehearsals in the summer of 1896. As an interim measure, he would have to make do for the coming winter with engaging a younger quartet. The new invitation was duly sent, repeating the offer of 5,000 rubles, but as the Duke's letter mentions, the death of Charles Halle on the 25th of October in 1895 had now changed Brodsky's circumstances to the point where it was likely that he would finally decline the Duke's offer. Brodsky's acceptance of Halle's private offer was made in a letter of the 10th of January 1895. This hasn't survived, but it's mentioned in Halley's reply 4 days later, in which he wrote to thank him for it. The official offer from the Royal Manchester College was made on the 25th of January, on which day it was agreed in council, and Brodsky's acceptance was formally minuted on the 20th of February. That, however, is only half the story. In his invitation to Brodsky to replace the existing professor of violin, Willi Hess, Halley implied that Hess is obliged, owing to health considerations, to leave England, and I desire to ask you whether you would be willing to accept the vacant positions. May I ask you to let me know quickly what you think about this matter, so that I may act officially. Mr. Hess only gave his demission 2 days ago, and I should like to be able to propose his successor to the directors of the college. This was a bare-faced lie. Hess had been asked to be released from his contract in order to take up the offer of a better post in Cologne. At its previous meeting on the 2nd of January, the council had resolved not to prevent Hess from retiring before his contract expired, but decided to set up a subcommittee headed by Halley to persuade Hess to stay until the end of July. The same day, Hess explained to them in person that his wishes had, since writing his letter of resignation, undergone a change, especially as he found that his extra-collegiate duties in Manchester next winter would be less onerous if he stayed, and he therefore requested permission to withdraw his resignation at the same time undertaking to remain in Manchester. Oh dear. This didn't quite put Halley in as much of a tight spot as you might imagine. He possibly realised that Brodsky would not be able to take up his appointment until the start of the new academic year in the autumn, giving Halley some time to turn things round. He might even have engineered Hess's staying on because of this. But then, at the meeting on the 25th of January, another letter from Hess was read, reinstating his decision to resign. When I saw the gentlemen of the council, I took it for granted that my inability to leave in April would put an end to all negotiation. I felt in honour bound to give my friends in Cologne the opportunity to decide whether they would wait for me until September. This they have agreed to do, and I am afraid that I have now no alternative but to follow the call to Cologne after my engagement with the Royal College has come to an end. The council resolved to accept Hess's resignation as of the 25th of July, and they minuted the principal, having stated that after full inquiry he was of the opinion the appointment of Mr. Adolf Brodsky as principal professor of the violin would be highly to the advantage of the college. For Halley was of the opinion, we need to read, Halley had already engineered a fait accompli. Brodsky was offered the violin professorship on a salary of £500 a year, with 15 hours tuition per week. The contract was initially for 1 year. He spent part of the late spring and summer in Russia, during which latter period Halley was in South Africa. Brodsky was certainly in Manchester by the end of September, having led the Liverpool Philharmonic in a concert under Halley shortly before that. There was a big overlap at that period between Halley players and Liverpool players, and part of his contract was that he would actually lead both. It was actually to prove his only concert to be conducted by Halley, because Halley died suddenly on the 25th of October. 5 days later, the RMCM Council met and resolved that the chairman, Mr. Gustav Behrens, Mr. Broadfield and Mr. Murray, be named a committee to interview Mr. Brodsky with a view to his appointment as principal of the college in the first instance for the remainder of the present session, and that this committee be requested to report to an adjourned meeting of this council to be held on Wednesday next at 12 noon. At that meeting, it was minuted that the report of the special committee appointed to confer with Mr. Brodsky be approved, and that he be appointed principal of the college to the end of July next at a salary at the rate of £300 per annum, in addition to the stipend attached to his professorship. And this time there was no double dealing. Brodsky was to remain principal for the next 34 years until his death in January 1929. To sum up then, it's easy to say with hindsight that Brodsky's brief American career was an unfortunate one for him, as it is to offer the truism that New York's loss, and indeed Duke Georg's loss, was Manchester's gain. Other observations which can be drawn from it are of a greater significance, I think, not least Brodsky's position as a European musician compensating for a sense of cultural displacement by maintaining allegiance to a Eurocentric musical canon. Like the psalmist, he attempted to sing the Lord's song in a strange land, only to find that its artistic values did not accord with his own. His faith in those values and his belief in their ultimate superiority over a musical scene driven largely by financial considerations speaks of an idealism, but an idealism supported by principle. That Brodsky was prepared to stand apart from rank-and-file orchestral members in not accepting Damrosch's revised terms bears this out. Taken alongside the bold affirmation of his own artistic status in his apologia to the New York Tribune, it suggests an individual whose own self-perception placed him apart from his colleagues and who therefore had no option but to be guided by nobler artistic principles, even if, at the time, the inevitable outcome was a form of cultural martyrdom. I can't ask the first question this time.
That's right. I wrote down headhunting as a thing that interested me. How much of that was going on, do you think, in this scene? Was it particular, star European musicians that were internationally headhunted, as it were?
Well, I mean, that reference by Howard Shannett suggests that Damrosch, at least, was keen to get European musicians over. And certainly if you look at Halle's list of staff for the first staff of the Royal Manchester College, it's all done by headhunting. He drew up a list, and there were certain members of staff that he was so desperate to get. I mean, there was one particular vocal teacher. He paid her way over the odds because he was so desperate. And, even when she'd accepted, he then got really worked up about whether he would have enough pupils for her. But she was, everybody else was paid something like 7 and 6pence an hour, pro rata. And here's this Mrs. Lemon Sherrington, who's getting paid £1,000 a year as a permanent contract. So it did go on. It went on. I mean, most of the staff appointments at this college in the 70s and 80s were done by word of mouth. They were never advertised.
Following on from that, I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you go about your work with sources when you research something like this. Because of course there's this really impressive array of materials that you can draw on, but there are always gaps, as you say. And then there are sources that are perhaps not perfectly reliable, or right
it pays to know lots of music librarians around the world. And thank God for digitized sources. I mean, all that New York newspaper stuff was all digitized by the Library of Congress, so I could do it from my office. I think one of the problems is that you sometimes get sources that don't tally with one another. I mean, Halle's a good example of that, actually. If you read Halle's biography, he makes all sorts of claims for himself. He was that sort of person. He was very much an empire builder. He makes these claims of, I gave the first Beethoven cycle in England. It's nonsense, because there's evidence elsewhere that contradicts it. So that's one of the problems, that, you know, A says this, but B says that. But you have to look for clues in one thing that's going to say, well, okay, let's look elsewhere. And for example, you know, there are references in letters to other letters, but those other letters haven't survived. So you have to think, well, where is that information elsewhere? Well, somebody quotes from the letter that hasn't survived in their letter. And so you it's like doing a jigsaw where you know that all the pieces aren't there, but you're working with what you've got.
And then of course you've got the biographers like Anna Bronski.
Yeah. But of course she's hardly going to be objective. She was the man's wife. You know, she took against Damrosch from day one. She wouldn't even name him. Yeah. And she's always going to take her husband's side. So, you know, in writing about it, it's a very important source, but you have to take it with a pinch of salt, because she's obviously not as objective as another source might be.
So David was having always had. So no, I thought I saw.
No, I'm very happy to ask a question. So yeah, thanks very much, Jeff. That was fascinating as always. This is a very obvious question, I'm afraid, just portrays my own ignorance of history. I'm just wondering to what extent, following Brodsky's appointment, he sought to, I don't know, bring some of his kind of musical kinsfolk from continental Europe towards the Manchester College.
That's basically the core of my thesis. Yes, he did. I mean, as soon as he's here, I mean, on the very day that Halle dies, you know, he's writing to Grieg, trying to get Grieg to come to Manchester. You know, the Griegs were distraught when the Brodskys went to America. They thought they'd never see them again. And here he is, you know, in the midst, he's trying to pick up the pieces from Halle's death, and at the same time, he's frantically writing to Grieg saying, I really want you to come to Manchester. We're going to do this series of concerts, and, you know, and this is what we're going to pay you. And he's very lucky, because Busoni comes to Manchester a lot. I mean, this was one wonderful occasion when he thinks they're going to be both there together. He's arranged this whole concert because Grieg and Busoni are going to be there. And at the last minute, Grieg, who was a terrible hypochondriac, pulled out because he was ill, and it didn't come off. But where he couldn't get people, I mean, Tchaikovsky had died, Brahms had died, Novacek had died quite young in 1900. He couldn't bring them to Manchester, but he could bring their music to Manchester. And that's the sort of dominant trope that runs through all of his concerts, really. He's keeping alive the memory of these people in the concerts he gives in Manchester. And by doing that, he's introducing a lot of unfamiliar repertoire to his Manchester audiences. There's an awful lot of Tchaikovsky, for example.
What was their problem with Dvorak, as in like trying to kind of pull focus from the new world symphony? Was that just a case of just competition between two businesses type thing? Or
It was. I mean, it was the New York Philharmonic versus the New York Symphony. And it was the Philharmonic that gave the premiere of the New World Symphony. And Damrosch, of course, conducted the New York Symphony. And they were back to back, you know, one was the day after the other. And if you look at the press, all the focus is on this big build-up to this new symphony by Dvorak. And I think Damrosch was conscious of the fact that, you know, he was being overshadowed here. So he got his own back, but in a very odd way.
I was going to say that's a very odd way of
Yeah.
getting your own back.
Oh, there was a huge audience. She was very much coloured by a very bad experience she had when she was a young woman. To digress, Anna and her sister, they were from a wealthy Russian family, and she and her sister went to Paris in 1870s or so. They're quite young. I mean, this is quite a daring thing to do. They didn't go with a chaperone or anything. And they went to study chemistry. And Anna fell madly in love with this guy who was a rabid socialist. And she got as far as getting engaged to this guy. This is in Paris. And, you know, she saw herself as reborn as this sort of left-wing firebrand. And she always was a bit of a lefty. If you read the stuff she wrote in Manchester, I mean, she's far more political than Adolf ever was. But it didn't work out. But she had this crazy idea, and obviously the finances do it. She would come to Liverpool and try and pass herself off as a working-class chambermaid in the name of democracy and try and get a job in Liverpool. And it didn't work out, and it was a very bad experience. So her view of the Northwest was coloured by that, I think. But she's quite a keen suffragette. I mean, she lectured on things like the Russian Revolution and stuff like that. She's a fascinating woman, and she's somebody who needs exploring in more detail.
Is there a sense of who was the audience for classical music concerts or chamber music concerts in Manchester at that time?
Manchester had a large middle-class, affluent German community. And they were, to a certain extent, the mainstay of concert audiences. I mean, there are references during the First World War about the audiences are falling off because they appeal mostly to the Germans. Just down the road in Nelson Street there was the Schilleranstalt, which had been founded in 1859 as a kind of cultural centre for the Germans in Manchester. And they had their own concert series, and that attracted quite large audiences, and they would bring artists over from Germany sometimes. And if you think about the Halle was German, his successor Hans Richter was German. There was a huge chunk, if you were like, of a sort of German culture within Manchester. Ironically, there were more Russians and Poles in Manchester at the time, but they were largely working-class emigres, and therefore they didn't really have much cultural capital. But it was the Germans who had started to come over at the end of the 18th century, but who came over in larger numbers after the 1840 revolutions in Germany, and brought with them their industries. People like the Behrens family, the Siemens family, and they were the ones who had the interest in music, but they also had the wealth to support the music in many cases. So there was this ready-made audience. Contrary to what Anna thought, there was this ready-made audience in Manchester.
Did Adolf Brodsky have a sense of this, do you think? Or was it others?
I don't think he did. I mean, he'd been to London, but he'd not been to Manchester. But Manchester's reputation was well known. I mean, you know, with people like Richter at the Halle, and this man had conducted the first ring cycle. And, you know, London presses would comment on what was happening in Manchester.
So there was a sense that it was Anna's.
Yeah. And it was the largest city in Europe not to be a capital.
This is all time sheet stuff.
Mm. Mm. Any more questions? I hope so.